If you try and Google how big is the Elden Ring map, all the results will point you to the same figure: 79 square kilometers. The lands between would be the 6th smallest country in the real world, slightly bigger than San Marino and half the size of Liechtenstein. Is this number correct though? Well, it is close, but at the same time is also way off. This video is about the methods I've used to measure the map of Elden Ring, but it's also about the geography of the lands between, the highest peaks, the deepest ravines, and everything else that's in between. So let's start from the beginning and find out where this figure came from. The original source is a post by Reddit user LustyBatch, who, back in February 27, 2022, just 2 days after the game released, had an edible hit too hard and calculated the size of the entire map using the size of the horse and a breach to estimate lengths. This exact figure was then reported over the next few days by pretty much every other website, and of course ended up in the many video games map sites comparison videos. So, first of all, my respect goes to LustyBatch, because the figure he got is pretty close to the real one, considering how he got it. And it's quite unbelievable that every website ran with this figure without any sort of verification, and often without even bothering to mention him as the original source. Also, as pointed out in his original post, that estimate is for the size of the whole map, including the water. I think you can see what's the problem with that. I don't think it's fair to say that the game is 80 square kilometers when the vast majority of it is not accessible. While there's definitely a correlation between the two things, the size of a map is not always equal to the size of a game. There are exceptions, of course. In both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, you can explore every square inch of the map by climbing, swimming and flying. In other words, the entire map, this rectangle, is a playable area. And in this case, it's really easy to measure as well, as Nintendo chose to make it a perfect 10 by 8 kilometers. An example of a more difficult game to measure is Grand Theft Auto 5, where it's hard to tell where the playable part of the map ends. While you do have access to planes and boats, the vehicles will break down if you get too far from the main island. In this case, product designer and GTA fan Dom Riccobene went out of its way to measure exactly how much space is there, including the playable part of the ocean. He used an in-game script to simulate LiDAR technology and ended up with a figure of 80.3 square kilometers. So these three games appear to have almost the exact same map area, but as we've seen, the part of the game world that is accessible to the player might be very different. In Elden Ring, there's no swimming mechanic, we can't fly, and climbing is not allowed either, so much of the map ends up being inaccessible to us. But how much exactly? The first step in figuring that out is to measure how big the lands between are. Thankfully, we won't be needing any fancy LiDAR technology, as we have access to the game maps, and they already use meters as units of measurement. So the methodology is simple. Choose two well-recognizable points on the map and measure the distance between them in the map editor. With that yardstick measurement, we now know the scale of the map, and we can use an image analysis software to calculate distances and areas. By this method, my estimate is that the total area of the map is almost exactly 88 square kilometers. And well, if we want to be precise, the game has two maps. If we add the underground areas, the total surface is around 110 square kilometers. So there we have it. That's the size of Elden Ring's map. Except that's even more misleading than the initial figure. We can do a lot better than that. As mentioned, there's a lot of sea around and inside the lands between, and there's also a lot of unused area surrounding the underground maps. So let's remove it. This first pass cuts the playable area by almost 3/4, and now it's 26.4 square kilometers. The lands between now have the same land surface of Tuvalu, the world's 4th smallest country. And funnily enough, because of the weird shape of the islands, the lands between could easily fit inside the atoll of Tuvalu's main island. At this point, you might have noticed how this seemingly massive world is actually much smaller than it looks. The maximum extension of the lands between is only about 8 kilometers north to south and 6.5 kilometers east to west. This spatial compression is of course extremely common in open-world games for gameplay reasons, as no one wants to slog through hundreds of kilometers just to get from one point of interest to the next. And the map could get even smaller. A lot of the areas on it are not explorable in the game, not only the sea, but also cliffs and other inaccessible parts. So I went over every section of the map, trying to stick as close as possible to the area that is actually walkable, in order to get the most accurate sites for the playable area of the game. And I'll also try and make comparisons to give a better idea of how big these places would be in the real world. So, Limgrave, excluding the Weeping Peninsula, has an explorable area of 1.7 square kilometers. The entirety of the first area of the game could comfortably fit inside an average US farm, which averages 1.9 square kilometers in area, or 190 hectares. If we include the Weeping Peninsula to the south, Limgrave reaches a total area of 2.4 square kilometers. The Weeping Peninsula also has one unique feature in the geography of the land. The area to the south, where Castle Morn is located, is the only area of the map that is more than 4.4 kilometers away from the base of the Erdtree. And 4.4 kilometers is the height of the Erdtree above sea level, give or take a few dozen meters depending on which map you are in. Basically, the Erdtree is so tall that if it were to fall for any reason, it could come crashing down almost anywhere on the entire game map, leaving only Castle Morn safe. Also, whenever I look at the Erdtree looming in the distance, I can't help but think of the Emperor Ganishka from Berserk, which is probably not a coincidence given the amount of influence the manga had on Dark Souls and Elden Ring. Moving on, Caelid is just a little bit larger than Limgrave minus the Weeping Peninsula, at 1.9 square kilometers, or exactly one average US farm. But there's a catch. Almost 30% of the total surface of Caelid is occupied by the Wailing Dunes, General Radahn's arena. More than 1 kilometer long and 700 meters wide, it has a total surface of 55 hectares, and it takes almost 3 minutes to run from one end to the other on foot. It is by far the biggest boss arena, not only in Elden Ring but in every Souls game. I haven't measured all the arenas in every game, but I'm quite sure I did measure all of the big ones. Liurnia of the Lakes is the biggest single area at 3.9 square kilometers, which is a little bit more than the area of Central Park in New York. The park would extend from Kelowna's Rise at the very south edge of Liurnia all the way to the back of the shaded castle in Altus Plateau. Walking along the entire lake area as you would in a park would be quite the nice experience. It will take you about 45 minutes from south to north at a relaxed pace, and you will be offered spectacular views of the Erdtree, the Raya Lucaria Academy, and the majestic 500 meters vertical wall of the ruin-strewn precipice. Above Liurnia is the Altus Plateau, which includes Mount Gelmir and has a walkable area of 2.4 square kilometers, similar in size to the City of London, the historical district that is just a part and is not to be confused with London, which is several times bigger than the whole game map. Mount Gelmir is the second highest mountain in the base game. Its highest peak stands at 1,180 meters over the sea level, which, while definitely not massive, is quite the respectable height for a mountain sitting on such a small island. What is not respectable instead is the size of Leyndell, the glorious royal capital, at least if talking about the area it occupies. Let's choose a small town to compare it to. You might have seen this picture shared by people noticing the resemblance between this place and the infamous Capra Demon arena in Dark Souls. This place is Morre, a tiny little village in central Italy, barely 400 meters in total length and housing around 100 people on a good day. Well, this tiny thing is actually comparable in size to the urban area of Leyndell. And that's perfectly fine. That's just another example of game scaling. The rest is done by art direction, or in this case, art misdirection. take something the size of a tiny village and give it verticality, imposing buildings, and a giant dead dragon in the middle, and you have something that looks much bigger than its real size. The incredibly well-done city of Novigrad in The Witcher 3 extends quite a lot more than Leyndell in pure area, while also being more realistic and grounded. But just like Minas Tirith in the movie adaptations of Lord of the Rings, Leyndell is fantasy through and through, and dominates the scene through sheer verticality and spectacle, ending up feeling much bigger than Novigrad on a visceral level. Let's move on to the Mountaintops of the Giants, which are the highest reachable point in the game, at 1920 meters above sea level. By the way, whenever I mention sea level, I'm counting the sea level of this sea, because the internal sea is 100 meters higher in level than the sea surrounding the lands between. That's because of this massive waterfall, 1 kilometer long and reaching all the way from Caelid to the mountaintops, as long as the Niagara Falls and twice as tall. Why did they decide to put a waterfall here? What does it represent? And should the internal sea eventually drain? I have no idea, and I love these weird world-building details. Anyway, the mountaintops are probably the biggest offenders of bad proportions between map area and actual playable area. Of the more than 11 square kilometers shown on the map, less than 15% of it is actually explorable. As much as I loved the slow reveal of the world map getting more and more insane in size, the truth is that the entirety of the game after getting to the mountaintops is about the same size as Limgrave. But size is not everything. Some areas amount to nothing more than a rounding error in total explorable map size, and yet they are some of the very best areas in the game, because they are legacy dungeons, with little total area, but very complex layouts and multiple levels. Still, let's add them to the total. Farum Azula is a little more than 600 meters from one end to the other, and the total explorable area is around 19 hectares, and that's a generous estimate, considering that 1/3 of Farum Azula's total area belongs to the arena where we fight Dragon Lord Placidusax. This massive platform at the heart of the storm beyond time is one of the biggest structures in the entire game. The space we can access during the fight is 285 meters in diameter, but the whole structure measures a massive 360 meters in diameter and is surrounded by columns as tall as 25-story buildings. To give you an idea of how gigantic that is, the London Stadium, the venue that hosted the 2012 Olympics, could easily fit inside this space. Also, while it's not connected to the rest of the world, the arena is technically the highest reachable place in the game, as it's placed on top of Farum Azula at an altitude of 2.2 kilometers above sea level. Going out of bounds with the camera will show drakes circling around below the arena, and some scattered geometry from Farum Azula. The rest of the world map is not loaded while we're inside Placidusax arena, with one weird exception. A low-quality version of the Chapel of Anticipation, the area at the very beginning of the game, is present in its proper location, placed more than 6 kilometers away. The other late-game dungeon is Miquella's Haligtree, possibly my favorite area in the whole game. The Haligtree itself is only about 1/4 of the size of the Erdtree, at 1,165 meters tall, but that's still 10 times bigger than the tallest tree in the real world, a California redwood named Hyperion. The dungeon starts about halfway up the Haligtree, and from there we have to fight our way down the dungeon for almost 600 meters in height before finally reaching Malenia at the very base of the tree. One way to skip part of this long journey is to take the plunge. The Haligtree is hollow, with Malenia waiting for us at the bottom. So, if we use cheats, right after the inner wall Site of Grace, there's a spot where we can jump down 160 meters and land right beside her. This dungeon has a really intricate layout, which makes it a real pain to measure, and my best estimate is that the entire explorable area is about 1/10 of a square kilometer, similar in size to Farum Azula, and only 1/5 of the area occupied by Radahn's arena alone. No wonder Malenia bore some resentment against Radahn, as it is a bit selfish to hoard all that space for oneself while your half-sister is literally living in a tree. And finally, let's add the underground areas. The Shifra River is the biggest of the three, with about half a square kilometer of explorable area, and also the deepest one. The Shifra Depths well goes down more than 500 meters, starting from a relatively low elevation point in Limgrave. So, by the time it reaches its bottom, we are almost 500 meters under the sea level. This point, right next to the lift, is the deepest point in the whole game, at exactly 492 meters below sea level. The height of a 100-story skyscraper, but underground. Well, technically there is a deeper point in the world geometry. It's in the Abyssal River, which measures about half the size of the Shifra area and includes the eternal city of Nokstella and the Lake of Rot. At the end of the Grand Cloister, there's this abyss that we can traverse by entering a coffin to reach Astel. And the bottom of the abyss is almost 600 meters below the sea level. Technically deeper than the Shifra River, but it's not an explorable area. I initially thought that the deepest point in the game must be found in the Deep-Root Depths, the smallest of the three underground areas, located at the base of the Erdtree, not only because of the name, but also because it is really deep down and hidden. You see, the depths can be easily accessed via coffin travel from the Shifra River, but that is basically teleporting, so it will tell us nothing about their exact location underground. Instead, we're going to measure their depth by taking the crazy long and convoluted way from above ground. From the initial entrance, below a well inside the city of Leyndell, we have to descend into the subterranean shunning grounds and traverse the maze of the Leyndell sewers. Then we take a long lift ride down to the Cathedral of the Forsaken, find a secret door in the back and parkour our way down a pit. The bottom of the pit gives way into the Frenzied Flame proscription, and in there is a secret door with another secret door hidden behind it, through which we can finally enter the depths. We can then descend for a further 200 meters to the deepest point, finally ending our downward journey about 615 meters below ground, surrounded by the towering roots of the Erdtree. Except, the starting point in Leyndell is located 1 kilometer above sea level. There is no way we are at the level of the roots of the Erdtree. We are not even deep enough to reach the sea, and in fact the depths are about the same altitude as Liurnia. So in the end it's a trick, but a really convincing one. The long way down to the depths is so intricate and hidden that by the time we get there, the feeling is that we really reached the secret foundations of the world. So we started with the figure of 88 square kilometers, or 110 including the underground. We then cut that down to 28.5 by removing the obvious, and carefully measuring only the explorable area, we finally have an estimate for the playable size of Elden Ring, about 13.5 square kilometers, a little less than 1/6 the original figure. Now, this figure does not include the 18 catacombs, 20 caves and 5 heroes' graves found in the game, as well as the various levels of some legacy dungeons like Stormveil Castle or the subterranean shunning grounds. But when talking about area, these enclosed spaces are little more than rounding errors compared to the vast open world. If we want to be very generous, we can add an extra 1.5 kilometers to the total to account for these areas, just so that we can make it a nice and round 15 square kilometers, which in a real-world comparison would be the same area as Shibuya, one of the central wards of Tokyo. So, as far as gameplay is concerned, Elden Ring's map is much smaller than either Breath of the Wild or GTA 5's, and is actually more similar in size to the scaled-down New York of Marvel's Spider-Man 2. The fact that the game can feel so massive, while actually being quite small compared to other similar games, is, I think, a further testament of the developer's skill. And bigger is not always better, as demonstrated by some of the DLC areas that, while visually stunning, are, in my opinion, somewhat lacking in actual game content. Right, the DLC. If you had the patience to stay with me this far, let's also have a look at the Land of Shadow. Following the same methodology, the in-game map measures around 29 square kilometers. And while it includes this beautiful representation of the Shadow Tree, we need to cut that out, together with the sea, to get a better idea of the actual DLC size. Doing that brings us to a much more realistic 8 square kilometers, which, for a real-world comparison, is a similar size as downtown Manhattan. And here is how it compares to the main game map. A lot of people had noticed as soon as Elden Ring came out that the 6 Divine Towers form a perfect hexagon centered around this suspiciously clouded area in the very center of the Inner Sea, and there was a lot of speculation around the possibility of a future DLC area fitting inside the sea, as if torn out from the center of the Lands Between. And in the Land of Shadow we do find the Suppressing Pillar, a tower stating that it represents the very center of the Lands Between. So, what happens if we try and superimpose the map of the DLC with the pillar in the center of the hexagon? Well, not much, really. We can rotate it and move it around, but while it would have been very neat, the Land of Shadow is just too big to fit inside the Inner Sea. Miyazaki himself did confirm in an interview that the Land of Shadow was once part of the Lands Between, so while it did come from here in some form, either it didn't come literally from this sea, or that is not perfectly represented at the level of the world map. Another possible interpretation is that the strange hole in the center of the Lands Between, which has always been there since the early concept art, came to be due to a great explosion at its center. Many islands around the world that share the same hollow shape are actually volcanic calderas, but a meteorite impact would leave the same kind of scar. And we know that, long ago, the Greater Wheel sent a golden star bearing a beast into the Lands Between. Back to the DLC map, I tried to remove the unexplorable areas and found out that actually most of the map is transversable, with some glaring exceptions such as the jagged peak. The total explorable area is around 5.5 square kilometers, which is not a huge difference from the 8 square kilometers we started with, and more than 1/3 the explorable sides of the main game. That is quite massive for a DLC, even though, again, I didn't love how empty some areas ended up being. What I did love was the approach to verticality in Shadow of the Erdtree. In the Lands Between, the main quest requires an ascending journey from Limgrave to Liurnia, the Altus Plateau and the Mountaintops. In the Lands of Shadow, instead, we start from relatively high ground, and most of the areas we explore are deep down instead, often teasing us by being clearly visible right below us, but kept inaccessible by the sheer vertical distance. And the vertical distances are just crazy in this map. The Abyssal Woods, in particular, truly live up to their name, as they are located 570 meters below sea level. That's deeper than even the Shifra River in the main game, and the woods are not even underground, just a valley sunk really deep into the earth. For reference, the lowest point of land elevation in the real world is the Dead Sea, sitting only 430 meters below sea level. This is the Shadowview Cross Site of Grace, and exactly 1030 meters below us is the ground of the Abyssal Woods, making this spot the single biggest vertical drop in the game that connects two explorable areas. We can try and take the plunge again, but in this case the fall is so long that even disabling player death is not enough to reach the forest floor, as the game automatically kills the player after 13 seconds of free fall as a failsafe. But the woods are not the deepest point in the Land of Shadow. At the south edge of the map is a hole in the ground called the Fissure. Inside is a massive underground cave filled with mysterious boat-like stone coffins, and at the very bottom is the Garden of Deep Purple, where the abandoned Saint Trina resides in a deep slumber. The garden is the deepest point in the whole game, at 740 meters below sea level, and I find it interesting that while we find Saint Trina here, her other half Miquella is atop Enir Ilim, in front of the Divine Gate, which is the highest reachable point in the DLC. But even taller is the Jagged Peak, the Land of Shadow's highest mountain, which is 1655 meters above sea level, even though we can't reach the top. A good chunk of the explorable area of the peak is taken up by the arena where we fight Baal the Dread, at the very center of the mountain. Baal is introduced as the arch-enemy of Dragon Lord Placidusax, and to reflect this, there are interesting similarities between the places where the two dragons reside. While Baal's arena is smaller, the whole stadium-like structure has exactly the same size as the platform where we fight Placidusax. They also look remarkably similar in some details, as the niches found around Baal's arena that mimic the appearance of the beastmen graves found in Farum, Azula. And speaking of dragons, we have to talk about the dead drake found near the base of the jagged peak, the biggest creature found in the entire game. The dead body is so colossal that it basically counts as a geographical feature, and as such it shows even on the game map, covering an area of 34,000 square meters, enough to cover almost 5 football pitches. To put that in perspective, the fire giant, one of the biggest bosses in the game, is only about as tall as the horn on the head of the drake, and the entire head is almost 70 meters long, the height of a 20-story building. But of course, the biggest thing in the whole map, and as it turns out the whole game, is the majestic shadow tree. It actually looks like two trees, one with a straight trunk and another spiraling around it, mirroring the spiral theme found amongst the Hornsens and in Enir Ilim. While being fairly similar in size to the Erdtree, a few of its bare branches are reaching up quite high, making it 4,870 meters tall. That's 400 meters taller than the Erdtree, and about the same height as the Mont Blanc, the tallest mountain in Western Europe. The size of these trees is so extreme that I find it difficult to compare them to anything existing in the real world. We can try and scale them down to a more familiar size though. For example, what if we imagine the lands between the size of a Lego set? The Tarnished is 1,68 m, while a standard Lego minifigure is 4 cm, meaning that if we're using the Tarnished as the reference for the minifigure, the Lego build will use a 1:42 scale. For reference, at this scale, the gigantic Placidusax arena would be the size of a large backyard pool, and the door entering the Erdtree would be pretty much a regular door, just a little bit thinner and taller. A build of the whole map at this scale would be the biggest Lego set ever by far, requiring maybe a few 100 billion pieces and taking up a couple of city blocks worth of space, if we choose to not include the sea. So how big would the Erdtree be in this unprecedented Lego build? Remember Hyperion, the world's tallest tree at 116 meters? That's about how tall the Lego-sized Erdtree and Shadow Tree would be, and I find it incredible that even while scaled down 42 times, these great trees would still be the tallest trees in our world, taller than the Statue of Liberty and the Big Ben. So, that's pretty much everything I had to say for today, but if you're still curious about anything that I haven't covered, feel free to ask me in the comments, I'll try and find it out. Thank you if you made it this far along this little journey, and I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, bye bye.